everyone. Welcome back. This is Professor Hall, and today we are looking at The Lost Generation, authors, philosophers, and artists. So, as a literature class, obviously we're going to focus on the author part, but many of these people believe that they were kind of philosophers as well, and some, like Zelda Fitzgerald, dabbled in art. And Gertrude Stein and her partner Alice B. Toklas collected art and had famous salon in Paris where they would hold philosophical discussions with many authors and artists. So it's kind of interesting to talk about all of them together. But in this presentation today, shorter lecture, we are going to really focus on what this term means, the lost generation, in general and then in specific with the authors that we're examining for this course. Neither of whom are pictured here. I just love this photo, though. These girls in a Parisian cafe drinking their coffee. There's a telephone. There are cars in the background. Everything is new and different, including their hemlines. And they're kind of looking at their silk stockings here in this photo. So let's get started. So, to begin with, the generation theory. Now, I do want to say that a lot of this is kind of pseudoscience, and it's sort of been debunked a little bit, but William Strauss and Neil Howe write this book, Generations, that's published in 1991, which discusses the history of the United States as kind of looking at things through this lens of a series of generations. And it is pseudoscience, as I said, so not really scientific, but it really is more of like philosophy, studying how groups of people act and behave as an entire group. So every 25 years. And so we get this idea that each generation has these common traits, and it unleashes or releases a new era of about 20 to 25 years. There are new social, political, and economic ideas, but this is also a cycle. So that when we look very far back, the generations we can see are part of a cyclical saeculum, they call it, which is basically a human life spanning 80 to 100 years. So what that means basically, I'm in my mid-40s. I won't say the exact number, but my grandmother was part of the silent generation, who is sort of just after this lost generation. And I'm sorry, my grandmother is part of the greatest generation, which is after the lost generation. The greatest generation are those people who fought during World War II. My grandfather was in the military during World War II, as was my great aunt. And so that is part of the greatest generation. And they were part of my long human life, such as it is so far. My parents were baby boomers. I am part of Generation X. I do not have children yet, but some of my relatives who have children, some of their children would be considered Gen Zers, because I have some older cousins. Some of my younger cousins, their children would be maybe Gen Alpha or whatever letter or number they're going to use for that group of people, right? So that's basically what it means, that in your lifespan you are part of one group, but you are acquainted with all of these other groups. And so therefore it makes up a larger cycle. And basically the theory states that there's a crisis that recurs every 100 or so years. That's followed by a period of recovery. And so because of that, the generational traits are things like the hero, the vagabond, that you have kind of groups of people who are kind of lost and aimless and wandering. You have groups of people who are searching for meaning, and you have groups of people who are heroic in their actions as they point toward recovery. So it's an interesting philosophy, and it's often used when looking at artistic and literary movements, but I just wanted you to know where it comes from, because there's so much talk right now about like, oh, millennials hate doing this, and baby boomers do such and such, and Gen Zers don't care about anything. And this is basically the book that started all of that kind of nonsense. So some of the generations in the United States, as I said, you might have heard of Gen X, baby boomers, millennials, Gen Z, or Zoomers, they're sometimes called now. But the prior generations included these, just so you kind of have the names. The Gilded Age, that's those born 1820 to 1842, progressives, missionaries, the Lost Generation, the Greatest Generation, and the Silent Generation. So I'm going to highlight here. We are going to talk about the missionaries and how they kind of influenced our generation that we're looking at. And here we have a picture of said missionaries because a lot of literature pushes back forward into the future and responds to the past. So sometimes we talk about like a pendulum, different trends go forward and backward, and each group is kind of trying to do something new and different, but they're responding to the past and reflecting the past in a certain way. And in a certain way, they are pushing forward into the future. At least that's what great literature does. So the missionary generation are children born after the Civil War, and they start pursuing crusades. So they really care about issues. They want votes for women and prohibition. And you can see that this is kind of looking at both purity as our motto. Let us help you vote. Prohibition in Minnesota. Blue stands for loyalty. Vote Minnesota dry. All of these things, right? This group of women. So they're passionate about causes. They want to see a better change in the world. Morality and faith are extremely high. Order would be important to this group of people, that kind of thing. The Greatest Generation that comes after the Lost Generation are people who were born typically around the Great Depression, sometimes during World War I, but they came of age to serve in the military during World War II. So this is having kind of this good kid reputation after World War II, fighting for our country and then coming home to invent machines and form scouting clubs and set up summer camps and build suburbs and all of that kind of thing. Again, not everybody, but in general, that's sort of how those two generations were seen. So the Lost Generation is really in the middle of this. And you notice from the names, the Silent Generation comes after the baby boom, or I'm sorry, just before. And then Gen X, and we have these names that kind of indicate that on the whole, some generations are doing great things, missionaries and greatest and progressive, and others are kind of lost or silent or just given a letter X to show that they're not quite as involved, I guess, and kind of lost. And that's the basic idea. So when people talk about the Lost Generation in general of this entire age group, you can see here a group of soldiers during World War I with their helmets, their wounds coming back. Generation came into adulthood just as World War I was beginning. They grow up amidst urban blight, unregulated drug use, child sweatshops, massive immigration. So this is during the time when we have technology, but we haven't quite regulated it. And there are a lot of problems in the country even before all of the horrors of World War I happen. So independent, streetwise, and unlike the the Greatest Generation that would come just after them, they have kind of a bad kid reputation. So these are the people that the missionaries would say, what's wrong with kids today? And we try to change the world and make it a better place for them. So the Flaming Youth, doughboys, who were the soldiers, flappers, they felt really alienated by a war whose homecoming turned sour. We talked about this in a previous lecture, that World War II was sort of seen as having a higher moral reason for fighting in that war, and World War I really, ultimately, people did not. So the young adult novelists, gangsters, sports stars, film celebrities, the Roaring Twenties was filled with these personalities where a lot of times fame came along with the writing, and people were as interested in the lives of these writers very often as they were their actual literature. We're going to see that especially with Zelda Fitzgerald, who I think her book gets very often overlooked because her life was so extravagant and chaotic. The Great Depression then hits midlife, just at the peak of their careers. 25% unemployment rate at the height of that. So 1 out of 4 people are out of a job. And this just leads to further alienation and disillusionment. And they age during and after World War II as elders. They're basically paying high tax rates to support the world conquering juniors, according to this scholarly website, asking little for themselves. So kind of just wanting to be left alone, and maybe a little bit more hopeful as moving into their later lives, which many of the writers that we're going to look at did not, for various reasons we'll get into later. That's kind of the generation as a whole. And you can see, hopefully, how this kind of dovetails with the modernist aspects of literature that we talked about before. Alienation, chaos, experimentation with form, the feeling of losing the sense of morality and balance, and focusing on psychology and the individual because of all of these things going on in the world. So now we look at the authors in particular. There are a lot of movements that I mentioned previously during modernism, movements of modernism rather, that we have the Imagist poets, and we have experimental writers, we have stream of consciousness, we have the Southern Renaissance, and all of that. But this class is just going to focus on the lost generation. And basically, they were lost in the sense that the inherited values were really, many of them felt no longer relevant. They kind of felt alienated from the United States. And here we see Ernest Hemingway and Fitzgerald and others here at a table in Paris again. So they became expatriates. And when we use the lost generation in literature, we're talking really about this very small group of modern American writers. Most of them knew each other in some way. We're going to see in a moment one writer talking about 2 other writers. They really lived and worked together in a couple key locations, New York City, Paris, and Hollywood, as many of them moved out to Hollywood seeking job opportunities when the Depression hit. Book sales are not going great, but a lot of people can still afford to go to the movies, and so many became script writers. But basically what we're going to see. Authors and poets kind of moving around as nomads, searching for wealth and fame, but really searching for the meaning of life and asking, what does life mean and what is the meaning of life now that we've seen all of the things that we've seen? And why Paris and why Hollywood? So after World War I, Paris is the center of culture and art. It's seen as an arts community, and it starts thriving in the city. There's also a sense of openness, a willingness to accept new ideas, particularly in the areas of sexuality. I don't just mean people who identify as LGBTQ, which that is part of it, sort of, even though that was still not completely accepted, but also people who had kind of open marriages or would have affairs. That's not going to go down very well in this time period in like the middle of Kansas, let's say, or as Sherwood Anderson is writing about, Ohio. Those are things that are still not going to be accepted by most of the people, particularly the elders who are still running things, right? The missionaries and the progressives. But Also, Paris is cheap. And it's affordable, much more affordable than other major cities at the time. So a lot of the starving artists kind of move there and they form this community and this sort of literary circles. It's creating now, which is much more diverse, not just in terms of women and people of color and people of different classes, but you can really put out a book. Anybody could put out a book that they've written, given digital publishing, right? And most authors don't know each other because things are so much more widespread. But here we have really literary circles, smaller groups of people kind of trying to do sort of the same thing or working with kind of similar themes and ideas, but doing it all in their own individual ways. And as I said, later as movies became popular, there's money to be made in script writing. Several of them were not successful, but others, West, whose book we're going to read, knew Fitzgerald and was his friend, and I think is a lesser known writer because he didn't produce that much before his demise, but really tries to show what Hollywood was like at that time, which is a fascinating portrayal of it. The mood of the generation. These are both from poets who are referring to the Western Front in France. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. I feel like you can kind of get from that and the picture, smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, so the burning, and they're cheering as the soldiers march on by, but they go home and youth and laughter go to die, basically, or see people dying all around them as smoke and mustard gas are billowing up, right? What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out the hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayer nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells and bugles calling for them from sad shires. Again, the idea that there is no meaning, that these people are just cattle, and that there is no choir or prayer or church service that can save them. There is only the shells and the bugles and the firing of bullets raining down upon them. I'm not saying that I agree with that notion, but I'm saying that that is kind of the prevailing sentiment of a lot of young people at this time, that all of our young men died for nothing. And if that was allowed to happen, then what have these progressive missionaries, so-called, been doing? What progress have we made? And how are we going to come back to a country that treated us like nothing more than livestock for the slaughter? So that's the kind of prevailing mood of alienation that is going to be seen in a lot of the literature we're looking at. And I just wanted to read a little piece of this. This is A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. The first half on this slide is how the Lost Generation got its name. And then this is the part that's always quoted. And then we'll see kind of what he says afterwards. It was when we had come back from Canada and we were living in the Rue Notre Dame des Champs, and Miss Stein and I were still good friends, that Miss Stein made the remark about the Lost Generation. So Hemingway is talking about his time and friendship with Gertrude Stein, who's another writer, and also Sherwood Anderson, he makes note of later, who we're also reading, is in the room, but we don't hear about him till later. She had some ignition trouble with the old Model T Ford she then drove, and the young man who worked in the garage and had served in the last year of the war had not been adept, or perhaps not broken the priority of the other vehicles in repairing Miss Stein's Ford. Anyway, he had not been serious, and had been corrected severely by the patron of the garage after Miss Stein's protest. The patron said to him, "You're all a generation perdu." I am not pronouncing that well. Sorry, guys. "That's all you are. That's all you are," Miss Stein said. "All of you young people who served in the war, you are a lost generation." So she's often credited with saying this, but really she's getting it from a patron at a garage who is mad at a mechanic for not fixing the cars in time. And this French patron just says, "You're a lost generation." Basically, these kids today, what are you even doing with your life? Why do you not have good values? This is, I'm sure that you've probably heard this from your own parents because everybody has. In Pompeii, the famous volcano explosion of Pompeii preserved that city for thousands of years. And there's some graffiti that basically says "kids today." This common complaint. At any rate, she says, "You're a lost generation." "Really?" I said. "You are," she insisted. "You have no respect for anything. You drink yourselves to death." This is the passage that's always quoted, that Gertrude Stein was sitting with Ernest Hemingway. She said to him, "You're all a lost generation," and that's where it ends. But if you keep reading the chapter, that's actually not where it ends, because he has some protests to being called this, having this moniker of the lost generation. So he replies, "Have you ever seen me drunk?" "No, but your friends are drunk." "I've been drunk," I said, "but I don't come here drunk." "Of course not. I didn't say that." "The boy's patron was probably drunk by 11 o'clock in the morning," I said. "That's why he makes such lovely phrases." "Don't argue with me, Hemingway," Miss Stein said. "It does no good at all. You're all a lost generation, exactly as the garage keeper said." And then later in the chapter, Hemingway says this, "But that night walking home, I thought about the boy in the garage and if he had ever been hauled into one of those vehicles when they were converted to the ambulances. I remembered how they used to burn out their brakes going down the mountain roads with a full load of wounded and braking in low and finally using the reverse, and how the last ones were driven over the mountainside empty so they could be replaced by big Fiats with a good H-shift and metal-to-metal brakes." So this image of being in an ambulance, as Miss Stein herself was, but she was older, being in an ambulance and trying to get the wounded to shelter and safety and possibly a hospital, and the brakes go out and you're on a mountain road and you don't know if you will die or if everyone in that car will die along with you, and you're just trying to get to safety. And at the end of it, after years of this, it all seems like it was for nothing. That's what he's thinking about, right? I thought of Miss Stein and Sherwood Anderson and egotism and mental laziness versus discipline. And I thought, who is calling who a lost generation? I thought that all generations were lost by something and always had been and always would be. The hell with her lost generation talk and all those dirty, easy labels. So it's interesting because at the same time that he's kind of acknowledging why the garage keeper is the way he is, that now he's fixing cars, and maybe it even does seem pointless after the horrors of war. And he probably feels alienated and is struggling with PTSD and trauma and all of this stuff. But at the same time, Hemingway's like, "F you and your dirty labels." Kind of saying Gertrude Stein and Sherwood Anderson are a little bit older than he is, and Fitzgerald, and certainly Nathaniel West, who's quite a bit younger. He's kind of like, you guys are kind of part of this group, but you're kind of not part of this group. And you're trying to write in the same way, but, you know, maybe you were older and you didn't really fully have that experience, or maybe you did, but you're now mentally lazy and you're just trying to label people things. So in a class that is entitled The Lost Generation, I want you to kind of question this. To what extent are they lost? To what extent are they individuals? To what extent are these just labels that could be applied to you or me, no matter, I don't know for this class as I'm recording this, but last year my oldest student was in their 70s and my youngest student was 16. So could any generation be called lost? That's basically what Hemingway is asking. And he wants, I think, as he's writing this, many years later, this book was published in the early 1960s, even though it's about the 1920s and 19 teens and 30s and all that. But he wants you to question that and to say, like, could I be thought of as lost too? And how do I relate to these people who are now older or now since passed away? Some of our writers, just so you can get a little good picture and a taste. This is Gertrude Stein with Alice Toklas in their Paris salon. Not a hair salon, rather almost an artistic gallery. This is the Picasso of Stein herself. You can see the hair, maybe, depending on if you're looking at this on your computer or your phone. And then we have Sherwood Anderson here with his cane, looking a little bit, I don't know. He looks angry there to me. Zelda Fitzgerald, who tried to be a ballerina. We're going to talk about that later and talk about her in relation to and apart from her husband. The lesser known Fitzgerald is Zelda, but her book is very interesting nonetheless. This is James Joyce and Ezra Pound together amongst other writers. And let me escape here. There we have Fitzgerald and F. Scott Fitzgerald with a little older Ernest Hemingway. And here is the Algonquin Round Table. And again, Dorothy Parker, who we're going to be looking at. So these are some of the members of the Lost Generation. Take that label as what you will, but at least now you kind of have a better idea, hopefully, of how the label came to be, how we look at generations, how we might apply that label to our own lives, and all of that. So I hope that you guys got something out of this, and I will see you next time. Thanks.